Hello, Namaste, Tashidilek. Good morning to our friends in America, and good afternoon in our friends in Europe, and good evening on the east in our friends in Japan and Australia and Taiwan. I am Vijay Kranti, and today we are going to discuss China's COVID policy and its impact on colonized peoples. And before we start this webinar, I would love to give a short introduction to all the organizer groups and our honored speakers who are going to join us today. The first group which is running this series is Center for Himalayan Asia Studies and Engagement and Tibetan Youth Congress. Uh, and now this time we have first time World Uyghur Congress joining us in organizing. The Center for Himalayan Asia Studies and Engagement, which is termed in short CHASE. It's a think tank which is focused on understanding issues which are impacting countries and societies in and around the Himalayan Asia. And it's a platform for exchange of knowledge, views, and perspectives among Indian and international experts, researchers, writers, and those advocacy groups who take keen interest on various aspects of political, social, economic, and strategic developments in this region. And then we have Tibetan Youth Congress, which is a worldwide organization of the Tibetan diaspora, which has 50 years of history and experience. It stands for the common struggle for Tibetan people for the restoration of complete independence for the whole of Tibet. And over the years, TYC, the Tibetan Youth Congress, has evolved as the largest and most active, non-violent, and non-governmental organization of Tibetan diaspora. And one beautiful thing about this organization is that it has emerged as the nursery of social, political, and cultural leadership in exile. And today we are very lucky to have World Uyghur Congress to be a joint coordinator, joint sponsor of this webinar. The World Uyghur Congress is a democratic organization which is striving for the independence of East Turkestan. As we all know, the Republic of East Turkestan was forcibly occupied by China in 1949 and was given a new Chinese name, Xinjiang. And the World Uyghur Congress has close contacts and is working, has a good working relationship with most Uyghur organizations all over the world who are peacefully promoting the cause of human rights and religious freedom and democracy for the people of East Turkestan. And the World Uyghur Congress is run by democratically elected leaders from all over the world. And currently, we have Mr. Dolkun Isa, who is the president, and our today's one of the speakers, Mr. Ilshat, is a vice president. As we, I would love to introduce our speakers right now. We have Mr. Ilshat Hassan Kokbore. Ilshat, he is the vice chairman of World Uyghur Congress, in the executive committee of WC. He is a very well-known cultural linguistic expert in Uyghur and Chinese. He's a political activist who understands the Chinese and Uyghur history very well. And he writes in Uyghur and Chinese language as a blogger. And his blogs are quite popular. He's a motivated activist and participant of human rights campaign in China. As a senior consultant at Booz Allen Hamilton, he has been very actively working there since 2008, and he comes from Gulija in East Turkestan, which China calls Xinjiang, and he studied chemical engineering at the Dalian University of Technology. And he graduated in 1983, and later he came out to fight for the freedom of his country. And these days he is functioning from Virginia in USA. So welcome, Ilshat, to today's discussion. And now we have Dr. Teng Biao. He We are very happy to have him with us for the first time as a panelist. So Dr. Teng Biao, he is a visiting professor at the University of Chicago, and he's an academic lawyer, and practically he defended many cases involving freedom of expression, religious freedom, death penalty to Tibetans and Uyghurs inside China. And Dr. Teng Biao, he is currently the Hauser Human Rights Scholar at Hunter College. So he co-founded the two human rights NGOs in Beijing. That's a very something very unique
Mm.
about him. One was the Open Constitution Initiative, and the other was China Against the Death Penalty. In these organizations, he established in 2003 and 2010. So he has received many international human rights awards, including the Human Rights Prize of the French Republic, which he got in 2007, and and also the National Endowment for Democracy's Democracy Award, which he received in 2008. So, welcome, Dr. Teng Biao, to today's discussion. And now I will introduce our uh, a speaker with whom our audience is very well already known, Mr. Engebatu Togochog, who is from southern Mongolia. He is director of the Southern Mongolian Human Rights Information Center at New York, and he is the editor in chief of the SMHRIC newsletter, which is called Southern Mongolia Watch. And this newsletter is published in English and Japanese and Chinese and Mongolian. And he can speak all these languages. That's interesting about him. So he is dedicated to human rights of the Mongolian people under who are living under Chinese occupation. He was born in 1972 in southern Mongolia, and he came out of southern Mongolia in 1998. And since then, he's staying there. And as a person who is advocating for the freedom of people of his occupied country, he has made the presentations before United Nations Human Rights Council, United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, and United Nations Forum on Minority Issues, and also before the US Congress and European Parliament, Scottish Parliament, and many other forums. So, welcome, Angebatu, to today's discussion. We will be very quick, shortly joined by our fourth speaker, Ms. Ladon Tethong, a very well-known Tibetan name. She just now told me that she's driving from somewhere to reach. She was in a meeting and she's driving to reach home. And as soon as she reaches home in Boston, she will be joining us. So Lauren Tethong is the director of Tibet Action Institute. Currently, this was established in Canada, but it works from mainly from Dharamsala. And she's a Tibetan Canadian, a political activist, and co-founder and director of Tibet Action Institute. So earlier, she was the director of Students for a Free Tibet, and she is known for many very dynamic and interesting actions uh, in favor of Tibet and for the freedom of Tibet. So she's a Canada-born Tibetan. Her father is a very well-known diplomat of the Tibetan diaspora, and she did her graduation from University King's College, and that is the place where she founded the first chapter of a very active Tibetan organization called uh, Students for a Free Tibet. And Students for Free Tibet is one of the best known names, like Tibetan Youth Congress, which is very active among the university students across the world. And they have made a very good impact. So, and of course, we have Mr. Sonam Tsering, who is the General Secretary of Tibetan Youth Congress. And he is my friend, my colleague in organizing these webinars. So welcome, Sonang Seringji. Welcome. So as we know, today's subject, before, I'm now handing over the mic to our friends, the panelists. The subject for today's is, as we know, the China's COVID policy and its impact on colonized people. We all have seen that since 2020, the outbreak of COVID-19 has made a big impact across the world, but especially within China. The policies of the communist government headed by President Xi Jinping has caused numerous problems for the people of China, and especially those occupied countries which were already suffering under communist rule for so many years. So they have their sufferings have been multiple. And today we have representatives from all these mainly occupied countries, Tibet, Xinjiang, Southern Mongolia, who will be speaking to us. And then we have a Tibetan Chinese scholar who will give us another perspective, which is uh, seen by an active and intelligent Chinese national. So, welcome everybody. And may I now request our friend from Southern Mongolia, Mr. Angebatu Togochog, to please present his perspective. Angebatu, please.
um, Greetings to everyone. Thank you, Vijay, also our colleagues from TYC and World Uyghur Congress for organizing webinar and giving us an opportunity to talk about the devastating impact of China's COVID-19 policy on human rights and socioeconomic conditions in the occupied nations of Southern Mongolia, Tibet, and East Turkestan, as well as in China proper. Um, I'm not in any sense a expert or a COVID expert, but from publicly available information, I know for a fact at least the following. One, COVID 19 is originated from China. Two, China has misinformed and disinformed the world about COVID 19. Three, China took advantage of COVID situation to tighten up its surveillance and repression in occupied nations of Southern Mongolia, Tibet, East Turkestan, and China proper. As you all know, the latest protest in Southern Mongolia took place pandemic from June to October 2020 in protest of China's implementation of the so-called second generation bilingual education. Almost entire Southern Mongolian population joined the movement in one way or another to demand the national freedom and the right to use their mother tongue, practice their culture, and maintain their national identity. More than 300,000 students took to the streets, and all Mongolian parents and teachers staged the general school boycott. The Mongolians believe that the Chinese colonial regime made the major miscalculation that the Mongolians would not resist, as there was no major resistance to the implementation of similar policies. And 2018 in more problematic and more restive regions of East Turkestan and Tibet. The biggest miscalculation the regime made was that the regime thought they already won the hearts and minds of the entire Mongolian population in southern Mongolia through 7-decade long genocide, ethnic cleansing, political repression, and cultural assimilation. Not only did all Mongolian students, teachers, professors, and ordinary herders rise up to defend their right to mother tongue and the national identity, but also high ranking government officials, party members, and even police officers of Mongolian ethnicity showed their protest through non-cooperation. For example, Mrs. Bu Xiaolin, then the governor Autonomous Region, then the governor of Inner Mongolia Autonomous Region, granddaughter of the autonomous region's paramount communist leader Olaho, and Xi Jinping's childhood friend also refused to implement the new language policy, which cost her political career. She was removed from position soon after the crackdown of the mass protests. In similar protest, a number of Mongolian head of the government of several banners in Shillingol League refused to implement the new language policy and resigned from their positions. In another case, Mongolian police officers refused to execute orders in Hokhod and eastern banner of Bern region. A U.S. journalist who traveled to southern Mongolia over the protest told us that she met a Mongolian police in Hokhod who told her that he and many of his colleagues refused to cooperate with the authorities. So, from the perspective of oppressed people, it is cool to have this kind of resistance, but we must admit that the cost of this kind of resistance is very high and the consequences is very serious. We estimate about 8 to 10,000 Southern Mongolian protesters were arrested, detained, imprisoned, or put under house arrest. Hundreds of dissidents, activists, former political prisoners, and their family members, including Mr. Hada, Mr. Shina, Mr. Willis, and Mr. Lamjaborjgan, have disappeared. What followed this the heavy-handed crackdown was a full-scale and full-speed cultural genocide campaign. The scope has exceeded far beyond the simple switch of medium of instruction from Mongolian to Chinese in schools. Uh, for example, on the propaganda front, starting early 2021, all government mouthpieces, including the Inner Mongolia radio and television Mongolian language services, were ordered to start replacing Mongolian cultural programs with Chinese one in order to promote the so-called strong sense of the Chinese nationality common identity. Slogans of learn Chinese to become a civilized person, mutual interaction, mutual exchange, and mutual assimilation of all ethnic groups to firmly establish the Chinese nationality common identity have been aired repeatedly from television, radio stations across the front in order to justify the eradication of Mongolian language, culture, and identity. The Chinese National Congress announced that education in minority language, as local legislation stipulated, is unconstitutional. Local authorities in the autonomous region reacted promptly to implement this directive. Classes on Mongolian culture and history taught in Mongolian in local schools are considered to be underemphasizing the Chinese nationality, common identity, and deliberately overemphasizing an individual ethnic group's ethnic identity and ethnic sentiment, and removed from the culture, removed from the curriculum across the region. And not only is learning Mongolian in schools prohibited, any extracurricular activity of learning Mongolian outside school has been outlawed. On the cultural front, until last year, for example, arts and cultural performance aired in TV programs during the Mongolian New Year must alter the Mongolian tradition to adopt Chinese style of performing arts, such as Peking opera. This year, the TV program for the celebration of Mongolian New Year were removed altogether. Sculptures and Mongolian historical figures have been taken down and smashed. Signs and Mongolian signs in Mongolian have been removed from schools, buildings, streets, and parks. On the literary front, Mongolian publications are banned altogether, and Mongolian books are taken down from bookstore shelves. Service on the streets are ordered not to provide service for printing and copying any materials written in Mongolian. Postland courier service are also instructed not to deliver any Mongolian books and publications. On the official front, a region-wide intensive training program called the Training for the Firm Inculcation of the Chinese Nationality Common Identity. In Chinese is known as 诸老中华民族共同体意识, was launched targeting the entire Mongolian population. According to related documents, these trainings urge the masses to communicate and train together, to take up the work of interfusing the feelings, to strive hard to create a social condition of living together, learning together, working together, enjoying together. Again, let me repeat again. To create a so-called social condition of living together, learning together, working together, and enjoying together, and urge all ethnic groups to accept the great mother country, Chinese nationality, Chinese culture, Chinese Communist Party, and the socialism with Chinese characteristics. The document also warned the Southern Mongolians that the wrong path of narrow nationalism can easily lead to the return of separatist tendency. Trainees told us that during the training they had to denounce their narrow nationalism and a nationalistic feeling and embrace the Chinese nationality common identity. They were required to provide all of their social contact and the details of their social media to the authorities. Toward the end of the training, they were forced to confess their supposed mistakes, including their past gathering where they wore Mongolian traditional clothes and sung Mongolian songs. They were warned that these mistakes went against the spirit of Chinese nationality common identity. They had to answer multiple questionnaires designed to assess their ideological improvement. One of the questions the trainees told us was, "How many Chinese friends do you have?" Those who answered none or few, participate in extended training before they are allowed to graduate. Before the release, all of the trainees signed a paper promising that they would not engage in any activities highlighting Mongolian characteristics or expressing their Mongolian nationalistic feeling. So, COVID pandemic and Xi Jinping's zero COVID policy provided the convenient excuse for the regime to justify and escalate its ongoing genocide on multiple fronts in occupied nations of southern Mongolia, Tibet, and East Turkestan. While in East Turkestan, millions of Uyghurs and other Muslim people are locked up in concentration camps. In southern Mongolia, a full-scale cultural genocide campaign is taking place. In Tibet, a similar campaign has been launched to eradicate unique Tibetan culture and religious belief. Whatever form the campaign may take, the ultimate goal of the Chinese authorities is the same: wipe out the language, culture, and identity of these three peoples and the so-called Zhonghua, or simply put, Chinese nationality, national identity. This goal is publicly stated and advertised by the Chinese government across China. There is a Chinese saying called "xing zai le huo," meaning gloating at one's misfortune. So the Chinese regime is exactly now gloating at the misfortune of the occupied nation, misfortune of its own citizen, and misfortune of the world during the COVID pandemic to justify its oppression home and hegemony abroad. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Angabatu, for such detailed description of what the kind of atmosphere the people of southern Mongolia have seen since this the COVID uh, epidemic started, and especially the way you have explained how the national identity, cultural identity of the Mongolian people is being wiped out. It sounds like uh, cultural genocide of an entire race, and that's very unfortunate. So I think this is time the world should look at China and see how what kind of cultural genocide it is committing across all occupied countries. So thank you very much for your presentation. And now we come to East Turkestan. Our friend Ilshat is here with us, who will give his the Uyghur perspective of what is going on in his country and his occupier country, China, these days. Ilshat, please.
Thank you. Good morning, my friend in America. Good afternoon in Europe, and good evening in India, Taiwan, Japan, Asia. Thank you first, Mr. Vijay, and also the organization Center for Himalayan Asian Studies and Engagement. Of course, my organization, World Uyghur Congress, Tibetan Youth Congress. Thank you for the invitation and giving a chance to express Uyghurs' voice. Before the COVID started in 2019, the Uyghur genocide already on the way. Uyghur genocide, this mass internment, mass sentencing, arresting, mass surveillance, it started from 2016, late 2016. But the genocide, we can go back far, starting from 1949, the Chinese Communist occupation. But because of the time limit, I don't want to go that far. We will start from the 16. And personally, I am starting from 16th August. That was my last call to my family, to my hometown, to my country, East Turkestan. That last call was with my mother. Now she is over 80. And I don't know if she is alive. And I have 3 sisters, and they have kids, they have families, and I have cousins, uncles. They're all disappeared since 16. No any news. I tried my best through my all ethnic friend, Chinese, Hui Muslim, Kazakh, try to find out if my mother still alive. I even asked for help from Radio Free Asia Uyghur Service. All comes with no any information. It seems like my mother, my 3 sisters, whole my family vanished in a black hole. Imagine, as a human being, if you are a son, if you are a brother, you want to know if your mom is alive. You want to hear her voice. With now modern technology, you can call anywhere from any corner of the world. us, Uyghur. No, we don't have that ability. Not because of technology, because of Chinese blockade of the East Turkestan. And just yesterday, the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation launched a search engine. The engine will enable Uyghurs in overseas to search for their dear one. And it has a 5 million records from 48 county of East Turkestan, 750,000 Uyghurs' personal record about their status. In here, what we mean status is how many years they were jailed, when they were get arrested, and what the accusation is. If you look at that search engine, look at that data set, you will find that almost this 750,000 Uyghurs so-called crimes is almost identical. Almost identical. This is a situation currently Uyghur facing. We're only able to search, find out our dear one by the Chinese leaked police files. Not by phone, not by going to our homeland, or not by somebody from our homeland come to us to visit us. This is a dire situation. And the COVID escalated, worsened the Uyghur situation. And adding to this, I want to also add some fresh news to our presentation. Adding to this, starting yesterday, almost same time with the communist victim of communism memorial, the Uyghur search engine, another news come out from UK and from Europe. In that news, the so-called puppet president or chair of the Uyghur Autonomous Region, Arkin Tunias, he was sanctioned by UK and United States of America because he is a complicit of the Uyghur genocide. UK and US and some European country sanctioned him 2 years ago, if I'm not wrong. And now he is intending to visit UK and visit European Union. How a sanctioned person can be invited to United Kingdom, invited to Europe, to sit with those politicians who are promoting, promising human rights, democracy, freedom, dignity for everyone. This is an insult to us, Uyghurs. It is unacceptable to invite a genocide culprit to visit UK, EU. It's almost like UK inviting Hitler to visit UK. Whatever your explanation is, unacceptable. And that's the current. And with the COVID, lockdown, the Chinese government able to hide their crimes. The genocide started 2016, late 2016. And 2019, the COVID started and China locked down the East Turkestan. And no news out. But some brave Uyghur send out some videos, some informations. People is dying because of the disease, because short of the medical equipment, medicine, and also shortage of the food. And the treatment is different. In one video last year, one Uyghur old man, he was just out from his apartment and police shouted to him, "Go back." And the Uyghur old man said, "Look at other side. The Chinese people can walk. Why not me?" The police said, "Go back if you don't want to get trouble." So Chinese can go outside. Uyghur cannot. Chinese can get food. Uyghur not. So in the Uyghurs' home, kids crying, mothers crying, elders crying, no food. No, nothing. And we know some video from Wulja, from Urumqi, but we don't know what's going on, what happened in Khotan, Kashgar, Aksu, and other places. Summarizing the lockdown had impact on the Uyghurs. After the genocide, it's ongoing. The lockdown, I would say, worsened the Uyghur situation. The lockdown intensified the genocide due to the intense vilifying and marginalizing the Uyghur community and the sowing of hatred against the Uyghur since the 2009 5th July, since the 2016, because Uyghur all becomes the country's number one enemy, the Chinese government's number one enemy. Uyghur was equal with terrorism, jihadist. So in the COVID, because of the distribution of the food, medicine, everything was under the Chinese hand. So when it comes to the Uyghur, always shortage. This is the number one. The second, the lockdown made the vulnerable and isolated Uyghur community situation worse. And due to the open discrimination in food distribution, Uyghurs are unable to sustain basic life and died of hunger, especially the elders and the children. And we saw that video. Children laying down in their homes' beds, no food, crying and having fevers, no medicine, no doctors, not allowed to even go out. Lockdown also helped the Chinese government to hide Uyghur genocide from the world by not allowing anyone from outside China to enter East Turkestan. And by cutting off the overseas Uyghurs' connection with their dear one lives in East Turkestan, like example like me. So we don't know anything. No information able to out. We are unable to contact with them, our families, our dear one, or anyone else, any Uyghurs inside. And also the lockdown that helped the Chinese government to legitimize the widespread spread Uyghur forced labor, or we call it slave labor. And in the name of poverty alleviation or securitization, the securitization means now they are implementing a new policy which called unemployment warning. Any Uyghur graduated from high school or university or middle school, immediately, if he is not continuing his study, he need to go to the work. What kind of work? Separated from the family, from the cultural base, sent to China or other Bingtuan controlled city and working in their factory. Like it is exactly a slave labor or prisoner, like a prisoner. Because before they get to the job, they will be military trained, disciplined, and they will following the strict schedule. When do you get up from the bed? And when do you go to the flag raising, so-called nationalism education? And when do you have your food, lunchtime? How many minutes? And go back to work? And when do you need to go to sleep? Everything was rigidly following the schedule and controlled. And they were managed not by the factory, by the police. And if the Uyghur was sent to Chinese proper, working in their factory as slave labor, the local police will follow them to control, to monitor, to punish those Uyghurs. So with the conclusion, COVID worsened the Uyghur situation, give Chinese a chance to hide it, hide the genocide, and the Chinese government intensified the genocide culturally, physically. Just one with the last example. I don't know if my mom is still alive. I want to know her. If she is dead, I want to just give a prayer. If she is alive, I just want to hear her voice. Same as my three sisters. If they are alive, I want to hear their voice. If they are dead, I want to give a prayer. Give a prayer. That's the Uyghur situation. Under the Chinese genocide, COVID lockdown. Thank you.
Thank you, Ilshat. It was a very matter of fact explanation of the situation as it has happened during the COVID and the way Chinese government has exploited this situation of misfortune into an opportunity to commit cultural genocide in an occupied country called East Turkestan, which they brand as Xinjiang. I think it's not a shame only on the People's Republic of China's communist government or President Xi Jinping. I think it's a shame on the whole world, including me and all of us, and the governments of our time who are keeping eyes closed, watching this tragedy that is happening in occupied colonies of China. You raised the issue of uh, the Chinese leader who has been sanctioned by the government of United Kingdom, Britain, and America. If these governments of Britain or European Union, if they are inviting a person who has been sanctioned for genocide of the Uyghurs in Xinjiang by these governments, and still these governments invite him for a reception or a talk, I think this calls for examination of the genuineness of these governments, about their commitment on democracy or commitment to human rights. I hope uh, you will agree that all these crimes of Chinese government call for a universal trial, an international trial, a war trial against President Xi Jinping, against the Communist Party of China, and all those leaders who are involved in the genocide, cultural genocide in these occupied countries. Uh, I would join you and everybody in prayers for the safety of your family, your mother, your sisters. We all wish you best, and let us hope very soon you get the good news. So thank you very much for
Thank you.
this presentation, Ilshad. It was a very moving presentation. And now we are coming to Dr. Teng Biao, who understands China from inside. As a Chinese national who has been who has been a citizen, who has watched whatever is happening in his country, and who had the courage to stand up and fight against it. Dr. Teng Biao, as I said earlier, is an expert, is a legal expert who has helped the under trials of the Tibetans and Uyghurs who were undergoing charges and trial for standing up for their own people. So, Dr. Teng Biao, we would love to listen to you. What's your perspective? Dr. Teng Biao, please.
Thank you very much. Thank you for your introduction. Thank you to the organizers of this panel discussion. So we know in the earliest days, the Chinese government covered up the outbreak of COVID-19, and they arrested whistleblowers and the citizen journalists, and like a Dr. Li Wenliang and citizen journalist Zhang Zhan, who reported in Wuhan about the outbreak of COVID, and she is still in prison. She was sentenced to 4 years. So the Communist Party of China should be responsible for the pandemic that killed 7 million people in the world. It should have been confined in the city of Wuhan if free information, free expression, and democratic decision were respected in China. And ridiculous enough, the collateral damage had been much greater than that caused by the pandemic itself. And almost everyone in China suffered from the draconian COVID restrictions and lockdowns. Doors and windows were sealed. Patients in urgent medical need have been denied care by hospitals, and people locked their own homes have been left with lack of food, and some even starved to death. Students were not allowed to attend examinations, and farmers were forced not to plant or harvest. And the so-called white guards have arbitrarily humiliated, detained, and assaulted civilians. And we have reports that Uyghurs have also died as a result of poisoning from disinfectants sprayed in their homes. And the Chinese authorities put in place a lockdown in Lhasa and 2 other Tibetan cities after only 2 cases of COVID-19 were detected. And what is extremely terrifying is that the Chinese Communist Party has established an unprecedented totalitarian surveillance system in China. I coined the term high-tech totalitarianism to describe this surreal dystopia. At least 500 million surveillance cameras are installed throughout China, and the number is still increasing sharply. And like a social credit system which documents people's transactions, moral and political behavior, and punishes them for any variation from its rules. It's the powerful phone trackers can connect one's digital footprint, real life identity, and physical whereabouts. So this Chinese government is very advanced at like facial recognition, voice print recognition, and gait recognition, so they can identify you through how you walk or run. And the government controlled big data, and even like a virtual reality was used to testify party members' level of loyalty to the CCP. And Beijing has collected DNA data from hundreds of millions Chinese, like Uyghurs, Tibetans, Mongolians, by cheating or by force. And social media controlled by the Chinese government, like Weibo, WeChat, TikTok, and others, are also effective tools to surveil all the internet users. And by strengthening high-tech totalitarianism, the Chinese government's goal is to maximize its capacity to monitor everyone's every moment in every corner at every moment. And furthermore, the COVID-19 has become a perfect excuse for the Communist Party to strengthen its control of Chinese society and Chinese individuals. 1 billion people were imprisoned unnecessarily for nearly 3 years, and windows and doors are sealed, that every citizen is required to show a green health code and also like a venue code or itinerary code, like 行程码、场所码 and 健康码, whenever they want to leave home. And there's a terrifying case, like before two human rights lawyers departed to meet their client, Zhang Zhan, who was sentenced to 4 years for her report, their health code suddenly turned red, which was obviously a manipulation of the authorities to restrict their travel. And there are other cases, like in Henan province, tens of thousands petitioners' health code turned red too, in order to prevent them from petitioning. So the zero COVID policy has been purposed more to tighten its perfect dictatorship than to fight the coronavirus. So it can be called like an academic totalitarianism in China. And the CCP refused the effective vaccines made in the West, though the United States and the European Union were willing to provide this more effective, better vaccinations. And there are two reasons. First, Beijing doesn't want to lose face. They want to show the world that the so-called China model of dealing COVID is better than the United States and than all other countries. And the second reason is the corruption. Like vaccine-related companies, which often have good connection with top leaders, earned too much from the COVID, and they have strong motives to block the import of Western vaccines. The zero COVID policy was suddenly gave up without a roadmap, without a basic preparations, and billions died since the early December when the zero COVID policy ended. Though the official statistics was only a few hundred. And the fire that killed dozens of Uyghurs in Urumqi sparked the A4 revolution, A4 movement. the people's frustration and anger have accumulated for 3 years since the outbreak of coronavirus, and even maybe 10 years since Xi Jinping came to power. What infuriated people is not only the endless lockdown, but also the arbitrariness, the absurdity, and atrocities and corruption in the name of dealing with COVID. And Tibetans, Uyghurs, and Mongolians suffered more than Han Chinese people for the past 3 years, 10 years, and of course longer, under the rule of CCP. But there's a positive message, like Chinese protesters during the 8-4 revolution chanted free Xinjiang, chanted like Xi Jinping stepped down, the CCP stepped down. And many more and more Chinese people began to realize the horrible truth of concentration camps in Xinjiang and the Uyghur genocide. In California a few months ago, Chinese students said sorry to Uyghurs. The COVID, the atrocities could be opportunity for many Chinese people to realize the suffering of Tibetans, Uyghurs, and the Mongolians. So I think it can be an opportunity for the solidarity among Tibetans, Uyghurs, Mongolians, Hong Kongers, and Chinese dissidents. And we should all work together to overthrow the regime of the CCP. Thank you.
Oh, Dr. Teng Biao, many thanks for adding a very valuable perspective of someone who himself is of Chinese origin, who himself has seen the Chinese system, communist system functioning from a very close distance. And the way you have explained how the Chinese system has been controlling people. You gave the example of the green coat and red coat, how the coats, the color was used to stop people from their genuine work, especially those people, those lawyers and others who wanted to help fellow beings. And I think this particular contribution from you makes this understanding of the Chinese system quite richer. And thank you very much for this. We are waiting for our colleague Ladon Tethong. I think she has not been able to join. And we have our friend Jumerate, who is watching this program. I think if she is around, I would love to see that she joins us. Jumerate, are you there? Okay, we will now. I think this is time we can open for question answer session, because Larut Tethong can join us anytime. She was to attend another meeting, and after attending that meeting, she has been driving back home, and she was hoping she would reach in time and join us. So anyhow, we will have advantage of her participation some other time, and if she can join during the question hour session, that will be wonderful. So there are some questions. Earlier we have been having our colleague Dr. Ayushi Ketkar, Professor Ayushi Ketkar, and today she could not join us. Otherwise, she has been handling the question answer session. So maybe on her behalf, I can ask some questions which have arrived us. One is that, is there any way of all the suffering nationalities, suffering colonies, to join hands to fight the tyranny of the Communist Party and the colonial masters of their country. Uh, this is a question for all of you, especially Ilshat and Engebatu, and those who are fighting for justice for the Chinese people, Dr. Teng Biao. I'm sure you all have uh, your perspective on this question. May I start with Ilshat, please?
Thank you. Yes. Actually, we saw some change, or I would say, after we years and years try to convince even the Chinese people that the communist is evil, not only to occupied land, it's also to their own people. They killed more Chinese than anyone else. Even the Second World War, the Japanese, no, the war that is not like the communist 3 years so-called famine. So, especially in the when we talk lockdown, I actually accidentally skipped one of my point, which was last year in 25th of November. Teng Biao mentioned it when in Urumqi, a Uyghur majority population apartment get fire, and in that we saw the Chinese government's irresponsibility because that apartment surrounded by police station, by military garrison, and by the fire station, hospital. But the fire started from the 14th floor and continued for 5 or 6 hours until the 19th reached. And we were unable to escape from their home because the Chinese in that draconian lockdown policy, they locked Uyghurs' apartment from outside. So the Uyghur inside, the mother, the kids, the elders, they are unable to escape from their home, and they die. How many? 44 from the Radio Free Asia's investigation report. And this triggered a widespread protest in China. Like Teng Biao said, some Chinese called unlock their lockdown and free. And even in Shanghai, some Chinese called the communists to step down. So this is a good sign with the coordination. And we are been a long time. We try to get did our best. We sacrificed a lot with life, with freedom for our independence, for our freedom, for even live a dignified life. But without, until today, we are still continuing this struggle. So we need coordination. This coordination we have intensified recent few years with Tibetan, with Mongolian, with Chinese friend, but still far to go, especially from the Chinese community. After the last year's 25th of November, the fire, yes, we had witnessed a big movement from the Chinese dissident protest. But after the lockdown was canceled, then there is silence. And the Chinese people can freely enjoy the life, even though it's limited, but still enjoying some degrees freedom. And they even can come to United States, Europe's, and they call it run. Now it is in a mess. They're running out from China. But no Uyghur, no Tibetan. And the voice from Chinese side is still very weak. So we need to come together to work. And I'm glad we have Teng Biao, our friend, and we have a lot of others. We can't one by one to name them. So we need to work more closely using this example and especially focusing on the youth in overseas, in the university, to get them stand up, to stand with us together, fight for the freedom, for the human rights. Thank you.
Yeah, Engebatu, you would you like to add something to it on this question that all these nationalities were occupied nationalities, occupied countries, uh, how much is the scope for joining hands?
Well, we all, including our three occupied nation and people of China and citizens of China, are victims of Chinese brutal regime. So, and uh, has taken advantage of the pandemic situation, and it doubled down its repression and surveillance and not only in these occupied nations but also in China, and that's the reason why all people across China, including Chinese citizens, rise up against this Chinese regime's the so-called zero COVID policy. And a situation in southern Mongolia was very similar and to that of East Turkestan, and Mongolians are prohibited from having any gathering and any sort of assembly during the pandemic. Of course, the government of China is using the lockdown and zero COVID policy as an excuse to crack down on all possible dissent and resistance. So are victims of this brutal regime. So the Mongolians during the blank paper movement, Mongolians also supported in their own way, even though it was not possible for them to have a large gathering or protest on the street, but they staged the various forms of protest through, for example, social media and internet. Yes, there is still, a lot of possibility for us to join together to say no to this brutal regime.
Yeah, thank you. And Dr. Teng Biao?
Yeah, briefly. So we have seen like an increasing collaboration among the Chinese dissidents and other oppressed peoples, and we work together to call for the boycott of Beijing Olympics, and not only last year's Winter Olympic, but in 2008. So the united front to boycott Beijing Summer Olympics, and we work together to call out the Confucius Institute and other influence operations by the Chinese government, so Mr. Elisat and Habatu, so we have already talk about the possibility of organizing a more like a coordinated network among these overseas human rights activities and other advocacy among Mongolians, Tibetans, and Chinese Uyghurs, and also Hong Kongers.
Thank you. And Sonam Tseringla, we would love to have some Tibetan perspective from you. One is Laurella could not join us, and second is Tibetan Youth Congress has played a very important role over the years in joining hands with the Uyghur friends, the Mongolian friends, and even some democratic Chinese groups. So TYC has played important role. Would you give us some information about it or throw light on this particular cooperation front?
Yes, first of all, from the beginning of the spread of COVID-19 from the Wuhan city of the Chinese, they have implemented a discriminatory policy to the colonized countries, as rightly pointed by our guest speakers. So when the all other plans to other cities of the Chinese cities were cancelled, but the plans in the Lhasa was still there. So, and since then, when the COVID spread in Tibet, they have implemented a lot of discriminatory practices where the Tibetans were not provided healthcare facilities. They were poorly provided with healthcare centers where both infected and uninfected Tibetans were put together, and then even they were forced to send to the camps where they are not providing any food facilities, healthcare facilities, etc. And if you look at the current situation, more than 1 million Tibetans' DNA were already collected by the Chinese Communist government, and their privacy, their securities in future is not safe. They are not in the safe hand, and even the 5-year-old children were not spared. And I think the same policy, same DNA collections are implemented in other colonized countries as well. And as rightly spoken by our other friends in terms of the colonial boarding schools, where the more than 80,000 Tibetan kids were admitted, forced to admit in the colonial boarding schools, where they have primarily aimed to eliminate and eradicate the very identity of Tibetanness. So these kind of policies are practicing, and it's very urgent, and the world needs to hear our voice, and because our voice is just, and we are fighting for a just cause, and because of which we have been trying our best to organize more joint actions. We have had a lot of physical webinars as well in USA, then in Delhi in 2018, and then some other places as well. And now we are having many, webinars, and I think it's very important. And we were able to bring our allies together, and together, I'm sure we will able to, expose the atrocities committed by the Communist Party of China to all those colonized countries. So it's very important, and we are very happy to be able to organize these kind of joint webinars, and I'm sure this will not be the last, and we will able to organize more live webinars, then physical seminars as well, and other joint protest actions as well in future. So I thank all our friends who are joining hands with all of us in exposing the atrocities committed by the Communist Party of China. And we all have the same story, as Ishad has said, he is not aware of the whereabouts of his mother. So we have the same story. Even me, I escaped from Tibet, and then my parents, they have no idea about the nature walk I'm doing here. And I can't expose the nature walk to them because of the Chinese Communist government consider TYC as a terrorist organization. So this is the situation, and the similar situations, the same cases, happening with any other Tibetans who escaped from Tibet. So we all have the same story. Our people are suffering under the same, oppressive regime. So our joint action is must, and I'm sure we will able to do it in the future, in the coming years.
Yeah, I wish you all best that because one thing which is joining, whether they are Tibetans or Uyghurs or Mongols, and even those Chinese who want to breathe in free air, who wish that their human rights are respected. It is the suffering, I hope, which will bring you all together. And I assure you that in this struggle, people like me and those who are not colonized by China, but they are sitting in free countries, they will join hands with you. And I wish you all success. And before I request Sonam Tseringla to give a vote of thanks, I want to share with you that we are going to have our next webinar on 13th of this month, which will be only 3 days after this, because 13th is a very important day. In 1913, the 13th Dalai Lama made a declaration of Tibet as independent country, as a free country, because it was Lhasa was occupied for a very short period by Manchu army for less than 2 years, and which had broken the long chain of independent China. So it was on this day, that is 13th of February 1913, that 13th Dalai Lama announced the declaration of independence of Tibet. So it's a very historic day, important for not only for Tibetans, but for all those occupied countries who are suffering under Chinese oppression. So on this day, we are going to have our next webinar. And the title of that webinar is Tibet has been an independent country in history. So please join us on 13th and we'll meet again. So now may I request Sonam Tseringla to please present his vote of thanks.
So with this, we come to the end of today's webinar, and this wouldn't be possible without the constant support of our guest speakers. So I, on behalf of TYC, Chase, and World Uyghur Congress, extend our sincere thanks to all the guest speakers, Mr. Elshad Hassan, Vice Chairman of World Uyghur Congress, Professor Thembao, Ngabatu Taucho, of course, for sharing your deep understanding on the same and making sure that the world understand the atrocities committed by the Communist Party of China. And in fact, some of our guest speakers are joining us for the second and third time. So thank you. And we will conclude today's webinar in a minute or two, but we will continue to make our voice heard by the rest of the world with our joint actions against the Chinese Communist government to expose their oppressive and repressive policies against the colonized countries. So thank you so much for joining us. And next, I want to thank Vijayji for being a backbone in bringing all of us together, and for being our old friend, old supporter of Tibet, for being a strong supporter of Tibet. So thank you. And I also want to thank our viewers, live stream viewers, for taking your time. And also, we request you to spread our voice, share the strain, so that the world will understand our voice, our call for justice. And lastly, I want to thank Lord Stenla for always taking care of the technical part, which is very difficult for us to handle. So thank you, and thank you everyone.
So thank you, friends. We see you again,
Thank you.
and
All right.
we meet once
Thank
again.
you.
Thank
And
you, everyone.
Right.
Pleasure.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Stay safe. We will see you all soon. Thank you, Vijiji.